Joining us now, the amazing columnist at the Washington Post, Josh Rogin himself. It's good to see you, Josh. Thanks for joining us, my friend.
Congrats on the new show. Set's looking great.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So
What do you think of the desk?
Oh, yeah.
What do you think of the desk?
Don't quiz him too much, all right? All right. This is very sensitive.
For it.
Okay. You better be. All right. So, Josh, you've been at the forefront of a lot of this lab leak reporting. Some of it has come to the fore recently. Dr. Anthony Fauci, let's put this up there on the screen, recently giving an interview, very much on the defensive, talking there about the more extreme that we get, the more obvious how political it is. Fauci has blood on his hands. Are you kidding me? This is also talking about himself in the third person, whose entire life has been devoted to saving lives. Now you're telling me he's Hitler. I think it's important that those of us, Josh, who are talking about the lab leak hypothesis and whether it be true and some of perhaps even Fauci's own mistakes, say, like, look, this isn't necessarily against Fauci. We're talking about the global health establishment. How do you think about Fauci in his role within the lab leak hypothesis and more culpability and all of that?
Right. So as someone who's followed this for a long time, like you guys, it's amazing to watch these various stages of the narrative. And, what's happening now is that the people who are coming under heat for not being transparent about what was going on in these Wuhan labs and what the relationships were between American organizations and the Wuhan labs are now getting very defensive. And we're seeing them get very upset about being asked a lot of uncomfortable questions about whether or not the research that they sponsored or research related to the research that they sponsored sparked the pandemic, which is what the lab leak hypothesis is. As Jon Stewart said, it's science saving us from science. And sometimes you have these scientists who don't want their own work examined because it calls into question this very career that Anthony Fauci is so adamantly defending. But if you just listen to what he says, it's pretty shocking to hear himself, first of all, refer to himself in the third person, which is a little odd. But second of all, say that somehow he's above reproach, that he doesn't have to answer questions, that even criticizing him is somehow an attack on science itself, which is ridiculous and especially offensive considering the fact that he's a public servant and, he works for the taxpayers. And of course, he is subject to oversight and scrutiny, especially when it seems like one of the labs that worked for him, that was funded by him, either directly or indirectly, may have sparked the pandemic that killed 3 million people. So yeah, we're going to have to ask some questions, and it doesn't mean we're calling him Hitler. And I don't think Holocaust references are to be tossed around so casually. I think that's really problematic, actually. And so we just have to sort of realize what's going on here. It's the Faucis of the world, not just Fauci, realizing that they're going to have to answer some really tough questions and now trying to get out of it any way that they can. But it's really troubling to watch.
Right.
His comments where he said, I'm paraphrasing the quote, but he said, attacks on me are an attack on science. I mean, to me, that's just insane because what you and others who've been focused in a serious way on this from the beginning are actually trying to do is to bolster the science, just to ask the neutral question of how this pandemic started and then what are the policy implications that stem from that. And Josh, I'm wondering, what is your view of the origins of how the media got this wrong? Because there were people like you, there are a few others out there who took the question seriously, just again, looking at it in a neutral way without trying to use this as a way to like smear China or let Trump off the hook or any of that nonsense. But there were a lot who were totally dismissive, who were saying this is debunked, this is a conspiracy theory, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what do you think is the origin of that view from the media?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because, the way that the story got all screwed up is directly linked to what's going on now with these guys like Anthony Fauci and his boss, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH. And what Francis Collins did last week was he gave an interview to the Washington Post, actually, where he tried to answer your question, but in doing so revealed a lot about how deceptive and misleading a lot of these scientists were. First of all, we have to understand that all the scientists disagree, okay? So for anyone to say that science thinks this or the scientists have a consensus of this, that person is misleading you. That's the person you have to look at skeptically because it's obviously not true because there are tons and tons of scientists who are publicly now at least saying that they believe that the lab leak theory is in fact what happened. Amongst them, Robert Redfield, a virologist who was the head of the CDC at the time, and many, many others. So when Anthony Fauci calls himself science, that's not only Orwellian, it's also just wrong because science is not a monolith. But anyway, what Francis Collins said was that they had a secret meeting teleconference call on February 1st, one day after the emails revealed that the scientists, even the ones close to Fauci, thought it could have come from the lab. And they had this secret teleconference, and they came to a consensus that the lab leak theory was crazy. And then a few weeks later, they had another meeting, and they said the lab leak theory was crazy. And according to Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, that should be enough. We should just sort of take that at face value. And of course, that's exactly what the media did. They heard from a small group of scientists who happened to include the hero Anthony Fauci, who everyone believed must be the hero of the pandemic, therefore could never do anything wrong. And they just bought their line, hook, line, and sinker, and they ran with it. And because it was an anti-Trump point, that made it even sweeter for a lot of media people who had a grudge. And then there was a lot of groupthink and source bias and confirmation bias and incompetence in the media, which is like, the thing that no one talks about is that like a lot of the reporters, they were just lazy, I don't know what to tell you.
Yes.
I just happened to be writing a book about this, so I did a bunch more interviews. That's why I thought I kind of got it right. But the fact is that, it was also fueled by these guys, Fauci and Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance and Kirsten Anderson, who deleted his Twitter feed after the emails came out, and all these guys who came up with this consensus, which was a false consensus, which misled us.
What was said on that you said it was a conference call, a meeting? What was so persuasive to them that they thought we're just going to dismiss this out of hand?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think that's kind of the point, is that there's nothing that could have persuaded them in that amount of time. One day after the emails show that they were thinking, oh, maybe the lab leak theory is a thing, the very next day, they had a meeting like, oh, no, we're pretty persuaded it's a natural origin. So obviously they hadn't done their homework. And, that's why the narrative that they created was so misleading, because they must have known that they couldn't have come to this conclusion so quickly. But they were doing it for a reason, because they were covering their own tushies. And they were doing that because it worked, this $200 million program to dig up viruses all over the world, including in China, and bring them back to a bunch of labs, was now going to be under scrutiny. And, if it turns out, and we don't know, right? You don't know, I don't know if this came from the lab or not. But if it turns out to be true, well, then their entire industry of virus collection and playing around with viruses, whether you call it gain of function or call it whatever, because they don't like to call it gain of function, because that means they would have to subject it to oversight, which they didn't do, But the fact is, whatever you call it, that whole industry would have to be necessarily re-examined, probably, reined in greatly. And that's what they can't face. That's what the Anthony Fauci's and Peter Daszak's of the world can't face, is that their life's work may have been connected to the pandemic that's plaguing the world, not through intentionality, not because they're bad people, but because, science is not infallible, and neither is Anthony Fauci.
I'm so glad that you always put it that way, Josh, because again, we're talking about incentives, and we're also talking about then whether people have an incentive in order to make sure that something is true or not. You have spotlighted the Global Virome Project. I've been trying to bring a lot of attention to this. Throwing $1.2 billion at more gain-of-function research seems like the worst thing we could do when we have questions. Are there serious efforts yet to rein it in? Is it still going forward? I just want to make sure we can update the audience.
We have to be clear that all of the plans currently in place to respond to the pandemic, if the lab leak hypothesis theory were to be true, would exacerbate and raise the risk of another pandemic greatly. In other words, we're doing exactly the wrong things if the lab leak theory is true, because we're planning to dump another $1 billion into this, $1.2 billion actually, into this project of digging up dangerous viruses and bringing them back to labs, including Chinese labs that have zero transparency and zero accountability, especially in a crisis. And we're going to continue funding them. And then if you look at what the Biden administration is doing, it's sort of like this kabuki investigation where they have this 90-day intelligence community sprint. Right. And I said to them, like, why are you sprinting? What's the sprint about? Why can't just walk? Just take your time. You know what I mean? You don't have to finish it in 90 days. We have to figure out what happened to start this pandemic, so we know how to prevent the next pandemic and why limit it. But putting that aside, what their other part of their plan is to encourage the WHO to press for access to China. Okay.
Right.
And the reason that you laughed at that is because it doesn't pass the laugh test. And you know what I mean? You can't think of that without being, oh, they must know that's complete bullshit.
Right.
And okay, well, if they know that's bullshit because the WHO is never going to be able to do that, then why are they saying that? Oh, they're bullshitting us. All right. So
There
you have to realize that the Biden people are talking out of both sides of their mouth. They're like, we really want to get to the bottom of it, and like, oh well, we hope the WHO gets to the bottom of it. You know,
Yes, that's a great point.
it's
ridiculous.
a contradiction, and
It is.
you know,
Josh, one other question for you.
Sure.
Putting the pandemic aside, do we know of other documented instances where gain of function, or as you put it, whatever you want to call it, this type of research has led to a virus escaping the lab? Because it seems to me that in some ways we may already have all the information that we need to know that we shouldn't be investing $1 billion in going down this path further.
Right. Well, here's what I would say. In the SARS virus, which is like the one that, you know, the last one that the Chinese Communist Party covered up, but that one only killed 8,000 people instead of 3 million people. That escaped from Chinese labs 4 times. Okay. That's a coronavirus that escaped from Chinese labs 4 times, killed 9 people, which is less than the number that were killed by the rest of the SARS virus. But still, you know, Fort Detrick, which is like the one that the Chinese Communist Party always points to. They're like, maybe it came from Fort Detrick. Well, they didn't actually have corona. They weren't doing that type of research, but they had a major leak in July 2019. That's true. It's documented. And it was shut down by a guy named Robert Redfield. He shut down the Fort Detrick bioweapons research lab because they had a leak, right? They weren't following the protocols. So the point is, these leaks happen all the time. They always happen. They're bound to happen. So the question is, you know, what are the odds that eventually another one of these very, very dangerous viruses that are the result of gain of function research are going to leak? And the probability is 100% given enough time. So all you have to think about is like, okay, if you know that things are going to leak, then how dangerous do we want to make these viruses? And is it really a good idea? Just because this is like what Jon Stewart ended with, just because we can do something in science doesn't mean we have to do it, and it doesn't mean we have to ignore the risks of it. And apparently we can't trust the heads of these institutions to say okay, this is a risk that maybe is not worth taking, and maybe we shouldn't spend $1 billion building even more dangerous viruses because it might spark a pandemic. And if these scientists can't be trusted to oversee themselves, much less the Chinese Communist Party, then someone else is going to have to do it, or we're going to be doing this every year.
Well said, Josh. We really appreciate it. Hope everybody goes and checks out your book, Chaos Under Heaven. Absolutely loved it. I listened to it on Audible. It was awesome. Thanks for joining us, my friend. Thank you.
Great to have you, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks for everybody for watching. As always, a special shout out to Supercast, where you can become a premium member. Right now, it's right out there in the description. You get to watch the show completely uncut. You get to watch it an hour early. You get to listen to it and listen to it uncut as well. What else am I saying? AMAs, right? You get the AMA, which we've been doing. Been having a lot of fun with some of those AMAs, totally uncut, unfiltered, all of that. So make sure you guys check that out. If you can support our work here at Breaking Points, we really appreciate and love you all. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
We'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.